Hi, and good morning and happy spring to everybody. So there was this buzz several months ago, and Kathy Bickle heard it, and I heard it, and Al Canner, Macrame, who is this guy? The name is sort of familiar, maybe even more than sorta. Well, Al has been with us quite a while, actually. Northern Colorado is his native guild. And I was a member there back in the 70s, rejoined recently and was excited to see their hybrid Zoom. And wow, Al Kenner. I contacted Paula Becker right away, their program chair. And Al rocks, he's eager to share. Al and I talked a few days later and he joined us for Night Guild already. That was back when Karen Pierce was with us. Yes, it was a good share, Al, we love you. So since retiring from teaching at the University of Colorado Law School in 2013, Al has had a lot more time to make those knots. And a super maker he is. There's another name for this textile structure. He'll be telling you all about it. It's older. It sounds much more sophisticated than macrame. But Al gives macrame the honor it deserves. His art speaks, his colors sing, the ordering of the knots is fascinating, and they're wonderful how they're integral to the whole piece. Please welcome Al Canner.
Thank you, Margaret. It's an over-the-top introduction. I'm really so happy and honored to be here. And I'm very aware that I'm speaking to a group, many of whom are highly accomplished fiber artists. So I'm sort of thrilled to be here. In many ways, I think of myself as a new artist, because only when I retired from the professional world about 9 years ago did I really start putting time into this. I actually began way back in the 70s, as I'll tell you, doing this as a hippie, making hanging plant hangers out of raw jute, as so many of us did back then. But before I dive into my own journey, let me just say a couple of words about the history of macrame. It really dates back just about as far as anything we know. In ancient stone statuary of the Assyrians and the Babylonians, there's evidence of sort of bottom of garment decorative knotting going on, and in 3rd century and earlier China, in textiles that are still there to be looked at, there's decorative knotting at the bottoms of many of them. So it's been around a long time, but generally when you look online and research this a little, the origin of macrame as we think of it now is really in the 13th century and in the nomadic Arab world, where it was heavily used on all sorts of fabric and on saddlecloth, on horses, and in northern Africa, it was often used on horses so they could bat away flies better with their tails and otherwise. And so it's really been around a long time. And the word macrame apparently either is rooted in Arabic or Turkish, words that sound a lot like macrame that I won't attempt to pronounce, and were the words used for the decorative knotting, often at the end of like tassels on clothing or other objects. And then sailors, really throughout time, but very heavily in the 17th and 18th centuries, played a big role in getting knotting around the world. They did it, of course, for all sorts of purposeful reasons on deck on the ships, but apparently spent endless hours creating products, belts and hammocks and things like that, that they then often sold in ports around the world. So that really did a lot to spread it. And then the Moorish movement to Spain brought it all throughout Europe and Italy. So it really has been around a long time. And a lot of it, I think, that I have seen older selections of macrame look a lot like what we've seen since. It was apparently very popular in the 17th century in Queen Mary's court, where all the handmaidens in court learned to do it, and then all throughout the Victorian era. It was apparently in almost every home that you could imagine. And that was really sort of apparently the heyday of it globally too, was the Victorian era. But then, as many of you will remember, in the 70s, it had a huge resurgence, particularly in the West and throughout this country. And that's where I was introduced to it. But there's some subsets of it. There's the owls that so many of us remember on the walls, and the plant hangers, and a type of macrame that's commonly thought of that has a lot of open areas between the knots, often in a sort of a diamond pattern of an opening or a triangle, but a lot of openness. A subset, which is what I certainly didn't know at the time, and not until a few years ago, is what I am doing is called, goes by the name of Cavandoli, which was the last name of an Italian teacher born in the 1870s in Italy. And she studied a little bit of the Montessori method, which utilizes, in combination with more traditional learning, a lot of gross and fine motor skills. So this woman, Valentina Cavandoli, introduced into the school around 1915 and a period of time following that, with children who actually resided in the school and either were orphans from World War I or apparently loads of tuberculosis at the time. And she had the students do this as a way to perfect their skills and their diligence and their concentration and so on. And then the children apparently sold these, and money was banked for them in their own names that they could have later in life. So Cavandoli, unlike the open type of macrame that we often think of and see, is a completely tight sort of, the word, not my own understanding of it, but the word I've often read connected to it is tapestry-like. And it's continuous and solid and endless use of the double half hitch, just piled up right against each other, making a very dense and tight woven-like product, and indeed has a weft and a warp. So it really fits into that world. And a woman named Elisa Ricci, which may be a person some of you might know of, apparently a well-known Italian lace historian, is the person attributed with having given the name Cavandoli to this technique. So let me tell you now a little bit about my own start in this, which is probably something that many of you can relate to. In the 70s, I was in my early 20s and living in the mountains, having just moved here from the East Coast. And we had plants to hang, and I had seen raw jute plant hangers. I forget where I got my jute that first time. And sort of just self-taught myself how to do. They were successful. And I had all our plants hanging. And then I started, because of running into some good cord, much nicer than the rough, very thick gauge jute. I started making much more decorative ones and incorporated some beads and sometimes even more than one gauge of the cord I was using, and realized what I was doing was being looked at as, oh, this isn't like everybody's plant hanger. And then I had, this is still in the 70s, I'm not sure how well this will show, but this is what I've thought of always since as my transition piece. This is a wall hanging, my first non-plant hanger wall hanging. And you'll see I still started it just like a plant hanger, with the hook at the top. And I, as I only knew how to do then, I sort of cut everything of the full length I thought I might need. And sort of, God help me if it wasn't long enough, because then I'd have to stop short. But it's almost like a sampler. I'll just sort of raise this. It's the shape and sort of the size of a plant hanger. But I was experimenting and learning all sorts of different techniques that hadn't really been allowed when I was just having to have the 3 cords that would hold the plant hanger. And I sort of even ended it in the way that, a plantanger might have ended with a more open netting sort of end. But that was for me, and I've always thought of it since as the real transition from plantangers into something more art-like. So now I am going to share my screen, and the rest will be on PowerPoint with you. Okay, thank you, Amy. Amy and I did a practice. I've never shared my screen before, and I'm happy to do so today. So I don't really want to, if some of you did owls on the wall, I don't want to put them down. They were very wonderful at the time and are sort of iconic memories of what that was like. But even though I still make many wall hangings, though a fair share of my work now is sculptural, freestanding, even my wall hangings have never been 2D. And here's an exception. This is one of my early works when I first had gotten into doing non-plant hanging. And I used a very simple mounting technique, as you can see on right here with 2 hangers, and did some experimentation, which was so new to me, of heading up and then turning myself in a new direction. So it was an early example for me, but beginning onto a new thing. And then also, this again is from the sometime in the early 80s when I had transferred, about throughout the 70s, I think I was doing the plantangers, and started incorporating some things that I found. I grew up most of my school years, public school years in Florida, so have a great love and affinity for shells and had quite a collection and tried to integrate into it. But still, I was very much influenced by the plant hangers, and the inside here, this is one of the beginning points, is no doubt one of those steel loops that so many people macramed and used as the hanging part, either covered or not with cloth. Close up of that. So there was a period in it was still in the 70s or early 80s when I had several very nice pieces. I thought, for me, they were big, and it was a very different time. I think they were priced like $35 or $50 or something. And there used to be a weaving shop that maybe some of you know that used to be housed in the strip of stores near McGuckin's in Boulder. And I had 4 of my pieces, 4 or 6, I forget now, that were there on commission. And I was so excited about it. And the store had a fire and all my pieces were destroyed. It was a huge setback emotionally, though at the time it was sort of nice to get the insurance money as if they had sold, but it wasn't very much money. And then I really put my stuff away for a decade and a half or something as I was pursuing professional life. I had been so set back by the fire happening. But I took 2 years off in my work life in my early 50s. I was about to reach the age that my father was when he died so young at 53. And I had just finished an 8-year segment of my work life as the executive director of the state hospice not-for-profit organization. So was really thinking a lot about life and dying and death, and knew that I couldn't really concentrate and think about my father's dying unless I was not working. So I really needed to leave the hospice organization. Some of you might know the not-for-profit life. I was completely zapped of all remaining strength, having poured so much of it in. So I took what was supposed to be 1 year and then 2 years off. It turned out to be just a time to be on sabbatical in my life. And during that time, I rediscovered my trunk of materials. I actually, right before I had stopped, in the few years before that, I had acquired an amazing amount of wonderful material. It was a sort of a sad time, I think, in America, where in the sort of mid to late 70s and so on, when almost every one of what had been the ubiquitous small family-owned craft stores, which you could find in every town you went in the country, they were sort of all closing up, and the big national chains were, sort of taken over. But there were a wonderful time of street sidewalk sales and other going out of business sales. And I had acquired this huge trunk filled with at least 100, I bet, spools of cord and twine of all sorts of color and material and gauge. So it was really a wonderful thing. And when I rediscovered it during my 2 years of blissful time off, I got so inspired by all the gorgeous cord I had. And this piece you're looking at, called Rusty Tulip. A tulip, many of you might know in Judaism, is the prayer shawl that men particularly, but men and women now wear around their necks and hang down sort of toward their waist or so, and during times of prayer. And this was sort of a statement at the time on my feeling about my position with the religion I had been reared in. The rusty nails, these are actually nails that are used in nail guns that a neighbor in a yard sale was selling for 10 cents or something. And I bought them and rolled them up into this shape and thought of them as the tassel hanging down from a tulip. And this piece for me was a big transition. I mean, not only was I suddenly coming into what I refer to very egotistically as the modern era of my macramé, my knotting, but I learned so much doing this. I mean, just as quick examples, and some of these things I'll talk much more about tomorrow evening when I'm more concentrated on the techniques. But here I did a little bit of twisting of a whole bunch of cords starting from over there somewhere, and put them into place, but then ended up with all these cords suddenly being placed right here. And I learned so much about how to make a bulge, how to form an expanding shape through this, and how to sort of travel with the cord, because otherwise you just keep going sort of straight down in the same shape unless you do things to formulate it. So most of the presentation right now, I want to organize around sort of trends and recurring themes that have occupied my time. When I was doing the work in my 2 years off, I created the piece you saw, the Rusty Tulip, and maybe started on the next one. But then I was employed again at the university as a teacher, and was able to produce in those next 8 years before I retired fully 9 years ago, about one piece every year to year and a half. And this was one of the earliest ones of that period, starting in about 2005. And it's part of a series of 5 pieces that actually the last one didn't happen until a few years ago, called the Public Land Suite. And this we're really looking down over, hovering over, looking at it. And I incorporated these 3 relatively good-sized stones into it, rocks into it. And one of the things I really liked about this, and was sort of a teaching moment for me, was being able to pull the color, if you will, from the rock I was using, right into my cords that emanated from it. It was really a great piece. And I should say, as an aside, many of you who work in textile and fabric, all of you probably know this, but the sun, the direct sunlight, is the enemy. And this piece, it's the only piece this has happened to of all my pieces, it is so-called decommissioned because when I retired and brought it home, I put it in just the wrong place and left town for 3 weeks. And it was so faded when I came back that it doesn't exist anymore. So be careful. This is another one of the Public Land Suite, in which I really got involved in incorporating found objects, all of these things that I found, in Colorado, walking across land. Another thing I want to mention about this to you, though, just as an aside, is how sort of poorly in my now photograph, this one is. In my early years, and really until about a year or two after I retired, I was doing all my own photographing. I wasn't yet trying to enter any shows or anything. And I'm left with, from my early works, some of which I still have and could get rephotographed if I wanted, but a whole group of photos that I know now just aren't lit well enough and aren't quite good enough for entering into shows and so on. But this piece, again, was a huge expansion cognitively, internally for myself about how to work with this medium I was working with and how to incorporate pieces in all sorts of ways. Of course, you can't walk across Colorado rangeland of any sort and not run into shells from rifles and other guns. So in several of my pieces, actually incorporated shells, which I find sort of beautiful hanging there. Another one from the Public Land Suite is Wilderness. Wilderness and the rangeland, Colorado rangeland, and the one you'll see next are on a long-term or permanent loan, probably, to the University of Colorado Law School, and are grouped together in honor of a great professor there, Charles Wilkinson, who's thought of as the law prof who coined the term public land law. This is a close-up of the bottom of the piece, and I've often thought since I made it that this is the best water that I'll ever be able to create, to make, and I should never try again because this is the best I'll do. And this is the third piece that's in that grouping of the Public Land Suite up at the University of Colorado, called Unnatural Bridge. I had just been to natural bridges to do some hiking and got inspired there. But this was the first piece I did that tried, in a bizarre, not heating of perspective, purposely try to create a mountain backdrop as well as sort of a close-up of water. One thing I should mention, because it probably is not obvious, is I never use any sort of form under my work. It's always just the power, and it is the power, the strength of the knots that keep it in its shape. And sometimes, or perhaps always, the pieces want to suggest to me what they want to do with their shape. But I've learned over the years by trial and error and all sorts of experimentation how to force the shapes that I have in mind. This piece is called Southeast Utah. I've always been pleased with sort of the skyscraper there that gives you the side view of what those wonderful formations look like. Now, another grouping of my pieces, if you will, that again has extended over a large number of years that I've been doing this since the modern era in about 2003 for me, is to create pieces that are reflective of certain art styles. And this one, which I call Color Plates, is Art Deco, was my concept for this. And I've always liked these plates that I've used here. They're brass drawer pull back plates. Many of you might remember, it's rare now to see this, but on like a piece of furniture with a pull, there'd be a piece of brass up against the furniture right behind where you pulled, sort of to protect, I guess, the wood. And this, sometime in the 70s, my wife found these for sale in some mountain community hardware store as used back plates, and we had them all this time waiting for this piece. Another thing I just want to mention to you, those of you who are weaving and doing other things that require design, of course, how lucky sometimes we are with good fortune when things come out, but also how hard we try to make it happen. And this right here for me, where my pointer is, this line was for me just so successful. I was so glad that I was able to pull that off, that I could cut across the whole piece and have it work in relationship and size to everything I was putting into it. This again is from the early days when I was doing my own photography, and the colors, so not wrong, are just bad. And a professional photographer said. Again, in the styles, this is the two sides of the same piece. I call this art glass, and it's of course made out of fiber, but it has that sort of look, I hope, to it, and is sort of suggestive of the Art Nouveau period. Here's a close-up of the top of it, and I want to point this out to you because many slides from now I'm going to harken back to this. I was so pleased. I started the piece right here and did a sort of a coiling of knots around, and you have to keep adding cord, or you don't end up with it sort of flattening out. Instead, it would actually be more like a straw, just going straight down pipe-like. But you add cord and you get it to flatten out, if you will. And because of the material I was using, I've since learned it only works with so-called rat tail. This is polyester rat tail cord. It ended up doing this sort of buckling like a large woman's sun hat that has sort of the waved rim. And I came upon the idea to fill in the sides and create this. Later on, as I'll show you, this idea became, for me as the maker, the real impetus and inspiration behind an entire piece, which I'll show you. And that, for me, in my creative process often happens, or maybe it's not my creative, maybe it's my craft. When I stumble on something or find a resolution for something in a piece, that idea for me then becomes, at least technique-wise, what controls the whole idea of the next piece I make. This is another Art Nouveau piece called Locked Gear. And the locked here is the hope of the suggestion that these look like tresses or locks of hair. This gear, this rusted gear, and these other rusted parts, I don't know what they're from, I found hiking on a mountain somewhere in the early 70s. And I knew then, because I was sort of newly into macrame, that I was going to use it someday in macrame. And I'm so glad I waited until 2015 to do it, when I sort of had the skill at that point to make this. Here's a close-up of it. This sort of hairy, fuzzy material is jute, which is really messy to work with. And it's clearly not the undyed, rough, natural jute of the plant hangers, but you end up with a pile, maybe some of you know this working with your various fibers, of just fiber dust everywhere after working for a while on a piece. Oops, I'm sorry. And that's the top of it. This is my favorite aspect of it, this part that really, to me, looks suggestive of like some African tresses that are made up in some celebratory way. This is Mesa country, sort of too obviously sort of cubism in display. This has been one of my earliest, most successful pieces in terms of getting into shows. Within a couple of months of it being made, it was off to Philadelphia to be part of Craft Forms, which some of you might know, which is always held at the Wayne Art Center. Every year they've had the show for close to 40 years now. And now I've been in it 4 times, which I've been thrilled. But this was my first piece. It sort of broke into the big time, if you will. Here's a close-up of it. I think maybe in this piece got into the beauty of same color changing. I mean, a different direction here for the knotting. as sometimes happens, using the warp or the weft suddenly, but doing it in the same color. The great thing with macrame, with the warp and a weft, it allows really sharp changing from warp into weft roll. And so if you use different colors for the warp and weft, you can make, tremendous design patterns. And that was a great part of its value and success with Valentina Cavandoli and her kids, because they made very sparkling geometric things. But you can also do it with the same color and that different direction of the knotting. I really find very appealing. And sometimes my style choices actually just go to a particular artist. I think of this piece, Stops, as a Mondrian piece, but using a Stuart Davis palette, for those of you who might know that artist. I'll talk a little bit about this piece tomorrow evening because it's actually an extremely sophisticated piece in terms of technique and the mounting and ending, because it, by design, has so many starts and stops. I mean, this was really a piece for the maker, really exploring and exploiting a lot of different techniques to have really clean starts and stops. And now another grouping of my pieces are sort of respond to found objects of one sort or another. This piece, Island Reconnaissance, was selected a couple of years back by the HGA and Weavers Guild of America Small Expression show, and spent a year on the road, which I was very proud of. And the found objects here, it might be obvious to you what these are. These are, you don't see them in this size, I don't think anymore. They're 4-inch long brass paper fasteners. And at the ends, which you don't see, they have a sort of circular flat top. We often see them just in a very small size, and you push them through the holes and then push back the brads. But I got these, I think, in some secondhand store in Denver in the late 70s or early 80s, a box of 100 of them. They were gorgeous and heavy, and I always knew they would be something. And at some point, I was looking at them and bent down their tops and realized I was looking down on palm trees or some other type of tropical thing. So that inspired me to create this island. It even has a little caldera lake there, you can see. And these don't come up so well in this picture, but these are shiny cords, particularly the gold cord here. And I think of that as the beach front of the island. And it even incorporates in several different areas. There's, I think, about 15 of them here, these 1950s era cast iron soldiers that were my wife's as a child. And again, incorporating found objects. This I actually bought at some great crafts supply store in Taos. I'm not sure if it's still there anymore, but it's some bizarre piece of metalwork hardware, probably part of an engine or something. But amazingly, it has 7 holes here, and it's not symmetrical. 4 of the holes are to the right, and 3 of them are this way, and this are different sizes and angles. So in using that, and then of course all this old bed springs, I think I had found this, I think at the same time I found the gear in locked gear in the 70s. I incorporated these in, and the 7 holes have each one of these aligns with one of these dropped spiral things. I call this spiraling under control as opposed to spiraling out of control. My own proclivity might have been never to name my pieces, but because I've so actively been involved in entering juried shows, you got to have names. They just sort of insist on names. Here's a close-up of some of that work. I always was pleased that this is waxed cotton cord, 2 millimeter. And it was at the very end of a spool. And so because of it being waxed, it retained, and it still has retained this 6 or 7 years later, these tight curls, which are so reflective of the metal springs that I used. And this for me is sort of the paradigm of my, they're not really found objects, they were purchase objects. Again, in the 70s, I must have been busy buying my stash to last me for the rest of my crafting. But I think in Chinatown, it was either 1 or 2 visits to San Francisco. I bought these Chinese brassware pieces, which are probably designed for, cabinetry of some sort. And I think in the same area, these Pakistani brass bells. And tomorrow night, I'll talk a little bit about this technique right here that allowed me to close it up. I started from here and went down and started here and went up and then was able to close it and decided on doing this sort of reflective technique of the perhaps mountain peaks that you can see there. I just got to tell you, this was hard. I really felt like I had accomplished something when I was able to close up that area and successfully, I think. And I already showed you wilderness, but I just wanted to mention here now the incorporation of the found objects, the driftwood here. And it was nice in a way to not have to worry about how to end or start, like here when it disappears or the water feature. I could sort of end it anyway and have them disappear behind. And I used upholstery tacks to keep them on. But it's the only time I've done that, where I've sort of hidden the endings and beginnings. Oops. Now, another trend, if you will, or collective area of my work, it relates to my upbringing as a Jew and some of the iconic design and features of things that I think I know for me, but probably for most people who are raised, in whatever the religion is, and for me in Judaism. And this is what I call a shofar. Some of you might know of the ram's horn that's used, particularly we think of it at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, to a loud blasting sound, traditionally out of a ram's horn, which is supposed to have the message, wake up, think about the world, sort of message. And this one I made out of leather bootlaces and rubber rope cock. I had to look up what rubber rope cock was. I found, I think, a big reel of this in a secondhand store. But it's the type of thing some of you might know that's used like in putting in framed windows to sort of tucked in as a bead around it, and then for other sort of insulating purposes like that. And it really worked well for this, which was also, for me, an important piece in which I was able to do this without it being just in a straight line. It has, you can't tell so well in this picture, but quite a bit of curve to it. So I was really experimenting with the technique as much as anything else here. And then part of my, as I call it, Judaica series is this piece, which is close to my favorite piece. It's quite large, as you can see, and very impressive on the wall. For Jews and maybe Christians as well, the iconography of the 10 Commandments on its tablet form is very much, a vision that Jewish people have. And so this was sort of a take, trying not to be disrespectful of the 10 Commandments, of having in the similar placement these 10 yarmulkes and having it be on a form that is at least suggestive to me of what the tablets might look like. It has 10 of these yarmulkes, and it was a long time making. Many of my pieces, by the way, take me about 2 to 2.5 months now that I'm been retired. And for 8 of these 9 years, I've worked most days about 6 hours. I've really been committed to this and into it, and usually about 6 days a week. But now things have caught up with me a little bit in terms of tendons and arthritis and this and that. And I've cut back probably by half the amount of hours. So for many years working at that rate of 6 hours a day, most of my pieces took me about 2 to 2.5 months. This piece, took me 4 months, but it's very large compared to most of my pieces. And this, again, you've already seen the rusty tulip, but part of my Judaica series. And then another area of work, sometimes while my hands are healing, has been smaller pieces. And this is one, and this is the piece I wanted you to heed something I was pointing to earlier on the top of the art glass piece, where I had this sort of structure, but considerably smaller, as the very lid top of the glass. And here I made it large. This is when I tried doing this in cotton, I discovered, oh, it doesn't work in cotton. It won't do that beautiful wave flapping thing. And then I repeated that form 5 times out from each of those. It's amazing. I mean, of course, it's just geometry, but when it's smaller, these 5 were all so closely placed. But then as I got further and further away, the distance between each of these is so interesting, the ratio. There is actually a fair amount of math of a simple type involved in what I do, but it's interesting to see that interplay. And this is relatively recent, smaller pieces I did. This is one of 3 pieces, one a long time ago and 2 very recently, that are mounted on inverted ceramic tea infusers. If you don't know what those look like, and they have like 3 or 4 holes going here, and then at the very top of the ceramic, there's 12 or 16 or something holes. So it was, with a little knot behind it, it was a great way to introduce new cord. I was so happy. I mean, I'm sure many of you experience this when something not only works that you weren't sure was going to work, but works magnificently. And that was true for me for this turn right here. Looking back at the whole piece, it's, this growing up and then coming down. I didn't know for sure I was going to be able to do that, and it worked. And then another small piece that I did just right after it, I thought I was going to be able to have that same going in here, but I was not able to do so. I don't know why. I thought I was using the very same technique that allowed me to go in, and I had thought this was going to be called Baptismal Font. 2 words together that I've always thought sounded beautiful. But since I couldn't make it into a font, a fountain, I decided on this name instead. And some of my pieces have been large. This in some ways has been one of my most successful pieces, called Cowhide. And I've thought of it as sort of my ode to the American West, where I've spent decades camping and hiking and having the visual impact of these things. It's called Cowhide because in my conception of the piece, in an abstract way, I thought of the shape and colors and so on of a rawhide up on the wall that you often see. But I also wanted to be suggestive, and people have told me I have done this, of other land formations, particularly that one sees in the American Southwest, particularly. And this, as many of my pieces that are wall pieces, I started, as you might sort of be able to think, by pinning down on a 24-inch by 36-inch, in this case, and 1-inch thick cork board. I do all my work on cork board, using T-pins to pin them down, secure them to the board. So I started there, and you can see all the mounting that went on all the way around it, and then started the process of going round and round and round and round, knotting until, and I'll mention a little bit, talk a little about this tomorrow night, this centerpiece, which is actually warp becoming weft. This has 8 inches of depth from the wall. And you can see right here, all you people who work in fiber, what an important moment that is right there. This is where suddenly the warp was becoming weft, just right at that moment. This piece, I'm happy to tell you, was one of 7 that in a year ago now, from March till August, were in a gallery for sale on Canyon Road in Santa Fe. Those of you who know the Santa Fe scene, it's sort of like where this happens, where these galleries are. And I got contacted because of, it's really meaningful to have a web presence, and I have a website. And this gallery found my stuff and wanted to have some fiber, which they hadn't had before or had very little of. And so these 7 pieces were selected, and my wife and I drove them down. And within a week, Cowhide had sold for a very impressive price. Of course, the artists in places like Santa Fe only get 50% now. For a long time, and still in many places, it's sort of a 60% artist, 40% gallery or museum. But a lot of places now, all the big cities and places like Santa Fe, it's 50-50, which feels like a ripoff. But you wouldn't have the exposure, of course. And another large piece that's had some fame and been in some good shows is Aboriginal Night. Ever since I started collecting cord, sometimes, particularly if I bought it in a lot, where it was already together and there was one price for everything that was in there, I was collecting black cord and not really knowing what I was going to do with it. But this was the piece. I learned a lot of things during this piece, and I think this was probably the most fun of any piece I worked on. This was an area of learning for me. I'm sure many of you stumble into things like this, though it could be that the knotting I do opens itself up for this more than things like weaving on a loom might. But this area here, which I really am happy with, I sort of knew what I was going to be doing, but I didn't know until it happened what this sort of fanning was going to look like. And then, of course, I just went for it. And I'll probably have a piece someday that's, sort of about that. And then another grouping of pieces, and some of these we'll look at in the next few minutes, looking more at the technique than the piece itself, are these multipods, as I call them. And some of them have names like this piece is called hexapod. We'll look at it in a moment a little more. And octopod. So this one is called speckled digits. This one, to my great surprise and pleasure, the second place award in HGA's Convergence in Reno a few years ago. In the mixed media, they called it show. And this is called Ink Spot and Clover Patch. So now I do want to talk a little bit about the specific techniques and result, which will be much more the focus, of course, tomorrow night. This piece is called Bandwidth, and some of you might have seen this even in addition to the wonderful publicity that this guild has done for my talk. But some of you might know the Fiber Art Network, which puts out Fiber Art magazine and a couple of very exciting shows and so on. And the publisher of which had a curated show that she did and included 4 of my works on Cape Cod a couple of summers ago. And she has since used this piece, Bandwidth, either in its entirety or particularly this section of it, many times in the Fiber Art Now magazine and the cover of an ebook they called that they did. And so it was a has been a very successful and exciting piece. And again, one in which I learned an awful lot. But I'm showing it to you here under discussing what happens when you mount on curves. I mean, traditionally, a lot of the macrame you would see are mounted on a rod, you know, just a parallel to the ground, straight rod. And that's the beginning point. But as I learned, and a lot of the learning came with this piece, when you mount on a curvaceous sort of surface like this, all sorts of amazing things happen that produce in various ways bulges, because in these convex areas, after the very first course of knotting that goes by it, if you don't start adding cord right away, you're just going to grow straight up perpendicular to your board that you're working on. So you have to add if you want to flatten it out. On the other hand, on these parts of the bulges, the concave parts, you have to delete cord. So if you might have had, say 20 knots right here, here you might only have 18, and here you might only have 16. And you literally, what I call drop the cord by pulling it behind and having it missed as you go by on the course with the next knot. I won't talk about this because I don't even know if I could. It's too complex to try to describe for me, but this piece has some very complex stuff going on to fill in all the space left from the curvaceous mounting. Here's Clover Patch. Quite a few times when people look at my work, and if I'm there to remark to, they say to me, "Oh, it is so complex. How could you do that?" And I think, and maybe some of you know what I'm talking about, it wasn't hard at all. It just happened. I mean, here I was coming in, from all these sticking out areas, and somehow I was just able to do this. And actually, the whole closure part here happened in an amazing quick speed with the final knot being there. But for me, it never seems as complex doing it, making it, as the finished product is. And boy, is that often true for other people who look at it. And that's another one, Hexapod. It just got selected, I just found out this week, for this year's Small Expressions in Knoxville at Convergence. And then it will be off on the road for a year. I had these beads for decades and decades and decades, some sort of matte glass handmade beads. And sometimes you have an idea for a piece and you just realized, oh God, I have just the material I need for it. And that was true with these beads. This is Octopod. This is another piece that, though this was a challenging and fun piece to work on, it looks more complex than it was. And I also had a lot of luck. I mean, look at this blue line. That was luck. I mean, not all luck. When I saw the possibility of it happening, that it could actually end up ending at my last knot, I went for it. But it's so much fun. I always have an idea, sometimes a very good idea, of what I'm about to do. And maybe 25% of the time I draw it. With a couple of my pieces, I've done very exacting drawings with, measurements and everything because they were geometric and so on. But with most of my pieces, and it's particularly true with my pods, which open up so much amazing challenge and fun, that a lot I had no idea how wonderful that was going to come out. I mean, I must confess, when I first started this, I didn't even think about these gorgeous areas here how they were going to look in the finished product. It was a surprise as they started being created. And I did something here. This might have been my first time. Now I've done it a lot in the last few years. All the cord here that's weft and showing is 1 millimeter. But in the places that don't look smaller, like not in this place and not in this place, everywhere else has a 2 millimeter warp. But in these places, it's a 1 millimeter warp, and they're actually recessed. I didn't realize how wonderful in real life the recession looks. This piece just came home from the Arvada Art Center, where it was a part of the Art of the State and won an honorable mention. I agree. Surprise and pleasure. This piece also started by my mounting the outside shape and going in toward the center with the last knot in the dead center. Now, I just want to talk a little bit, and I'll do a little bit more of this tomorrow night, about bulges, which are definitely a major theme in my work and a major technique that I've learned to exploit, and it's always different every time. But this is, again, the rusty Tulip piece I showed you. And this one way to create a bulge is to have a sudden intensity of chord amount. Because wrapped up in here, I don't know, there must have been 12 or more chords. And then suddenly they explode here. And the first row, which becomes sort of half of a semicircle shape, I only used like maybe half of the chord. But the next time it was 2 more were introduced and so on and so forth. So by cleverly forcing a sudden intensity of chord in one place, you can create a bulge. Or, as is true in many of my pieces, including here in Mesa Country, it was a critical part of the design was the bulges themselves. And this piece, which started here and just grew and grew and grew, I created the bulges as I went. They're actually an intricate, seminal part of the knotting, as opposed to any sort of an overlay. This is another piece that used these sort of cubical forms. This is about 2.5 inches worth of depth here around these pieces. And I started with each of these, and then at some wonderful point, they all became part of the same piece. But again, here it was the design itself created the depth, the sculptural nature of the piece. This piece was almost called Diamondback for obvious reasons, but I just couldn't not take advantage of the hubcap shape. So that name went out. And this is an example of bulges created by something I've frankly not seen anybody else do, which is combine dramatically different gauges of chord right beside each other. So the shiny rat tail that's, in various parts through this is only one of those pictures, is 2 millimeter. And much of the rest of it is 1 millimeter. And when you force them in rows right beside each other, it forces the material to make these big buckles. And I should tell you, in case it's not obvious, all of my work, because of the nature of the continuous double half hitch, is strong. I mean, pieces like this that are sort of cubical, you could really sort of even squeeze on them and probably not even change their shape. And all of my work without any infrastructure holds its own shape. This is another type of design creating of bulges. This piece, these 3 parts right here, used to be one of my better moving into a new age of plant hanger, the 3 cords that hang down and actually hold plant from the top. And I ripped apart the plant hanger, but saved these parts and incorporated them into this piece. But because it's sort of woven, this is again an example of a bad picture from the early days, It sort of weaves in and out. It created all sorts of bulge work. And then I have just the sort of clearly sculptural orb forms, which I've gotten good at, how to make these and form them. And you can literally, with these, which are relatively small in size, about this big, sort of life size, you can squeeze them in your hand and they just won't give. They are so strong. And this sculptural form is a piece of the only basket I've ever made. My wife and I, right before the world changed with the pandemic, were in Philadelphia and in Washington later, and went to the Textile Museum, now at Georgetown University there, and saw a Ghanaian basket that was for sale in the shop. It had no color really. It was a natural color, though these were nicer. And it had nothing like this going on the top, but it inspired me for the first time to try a basket. And I learned why macrame knotting is not the technique of choice for making baskets. This piece took me 6 months, and it was mostly 6-hour days. I masochistically chose 1 millimeter hemp cord, so it was very slow because a lot of knots per inch. This piece is also going to be in Knoxville this year. It got selected for the basket show, kudzu to something, or something to kudzu, it's called. And I'm awfully happy about that. You can see these cubist forms that I created to hold those weird parts. And this is another sculptural piece, my American Skyscraper, which is a big piece. It's almost 4 feet tall. And it has you can see here, some of the windows have shades partially drawn on them. And here's a rooftop swimming pool. And again, some of the shades partially down. And you can see here, I'll just point this out, I won't talk again about it tomorrow night, but the technique I have for, in 2 courses, even though it looks like 1 course visually, changing completely the color of the weft. So I was going up here, this was climbing from the ground, and I'd done this course all the way around the building that was red. When I got here, every other chord, the knot produces what looks like 2 chord lines. So this had been red, and I switched to white, kept that one red, so it kept it together, then put in the new chord, then and in this next row, all these reds disappeared. So every course, at least every other chord was connected by a knot. And the inserted one ends up being pulled tightly, so you can't really tell what's happening. But that was a huge discovery for me years and years ago, and I realized, oh my gosh, I can change the color of my weft. And then, this is toward the very end now of this presentation, but I've also done a few sort of real life pieces / whimsy. And this is probably my favorite piece I've ever done, called my Rainbow Trout. And it's done some traveling in its life to shows, I'm happy to say. But I've never put this one up for sale because this one I just like too much and want to keep. This one I probably drew out before I started and as I was working on it more than any other piece I had done. And particularly because I used to have tropical fish, but I'm not a fisher person, and I don't really know exactly how far back does this fin start on a rainbow trout. And so online, I printed out a whole bunch of different trouts and actually figured out exactly, 40% back or whatever it is, the dorsal begins and so on and so forth. And I started up here with this dorsal fin. And to my amazement, when I created this very beginning, had finished this fin, it's as if the rainbow trout came alive to me then, and always since has had its own living feeling to me, including this little flip of the tail that I'll end the PowerPoint with. But I do want to show you one or two more things. So originally, the American Skyscraper was supposed to be called American Skyscraper with Lions. And I had created these little lions out of macrame that I thought were going to be positioned, even though perspective wrong, but that was going to be okay. But when I finished them, I realized, they're not good enough for the skyscraper. So here they are. But for people who are inspired to, use macrame to create lifelike things or toys or, things that can be played with by kids, it lends itself to it, but they're very hard. I'm sort of squeezing right now and not really changing the shape of this. So I also wanted to show you that this is not effective doing this, I know, by Zoom. I should be able to pass this around and you can touch it. But I just wanted to show you what most of my materials come on. I mean, after that amazing time in the 70s when I filled up a trunk with going out of business hobby shop sales, I've now used, I'm sure, all of that over the years and pretty much buy all my cord now online, usually from the United States, but it's often been imported from India or China, though sometimes made here. And they almost always come in spools. This is what I've been referring to as rat tail. This particular is polyester. I used to be able to get it in rayon, which is made from wood-based material. All the old rat tail that I got in the 70s was that. Now it's petroleum-based, and it's either polyester or nylon. And then I work, probably my most common is cotton. This is 2mm cotton cord coming on a spool. And also this is 1mm cotton. You can see it's actually looks bigger somehow on the screen, but it's pretty small stuff. And then I just, in closing, just wanted to say a word about the glory of this, the fun part in terms of a maker's ego fulfillment. I've had almost since the beginning when I got into my modern era and was doing stuff that I realized was, pretty good, and people were liking that. My real goal someday, I hope, is to have museum placement with my pieces. I haven't really been all that interested and have never sort of assertively gone after selling my work. But one of the ways to get seen for museums, I've learned, is to get into juried shows. And some of the best ones are like the craft forums I've gotten into in Philadelphia. There's a historic philanthropic support of the fine crafts, starting with cabinetry in Philadelphia. And so this is a beautiful show with a lot of financial support and a lot of buying of work. And then all sorts of curators from the East Coast, DC certainly, from New York, come to the show and look at it. And this happens in other good shows with, the artists hope that this person from the museum is a curator who wants to purchase it. So I've done a lot of these shows. I've been lucky enough to get in. And what I found over and over, to my surprise, because I thought as soon as I retired and had time to go online and see if I could make connections with other fiber artists who were doing this work, I learned that there weren't loads of other people doing this work and almost no one doing it in the scale that I do it regularly. Some of what's done is sort of women's necklaces, sort of breastplate necklaces or bracelets, often very geometric, occasionally what I would call art, but pretty small in scale. And so many of the jurors have said to me when I looked at your work, and now you probably all know this is all done now electronically. Luckily, you get to send in your work just as an image and don't have to actually ship it off. But the jurors would say to me at the receptions and the openings, I looked at your work and I thought, what is this? It seems to be the case that there's almost no one out there doing this with macrame. So I've had a ridiculous amount of luck in getting into, even good shows, just because what I'm doing, to my surprise, is, not out there very much. And getting into the shows is so much fun. And if you win a prize, it's like over the top. And my work has been pictured in a lot of magazines now. So it's really been tremendously fun and a complete surprise. I had no idea this was about to happen in my life. Well, thank you for listening to the story of my knotting life. And I don't know if any chat questions have come in. I was promised that Amy would sort of facilitate that for me, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Sure. Thank you so much, Al. How inspiring and wonderful to see so much of your work. And I really appreciate your enthusiasm and passion for this work, which really came through in the presentation. Thank you so much. We have some questions in the chat, which I'm just pulling up now. One of the questions is, how are the stones incorporated in your work?
Stones. Oh, perhaps thinking of the continental drift as an example. That's the one that I told you is no longer in existence because it got faded. That one definitely has stones of consequence. And that is a piece that's freestanding tabletop, piece. So the rocks, the weight of the rocks, which would be a real issue, of course, if it were a piece hanging on the wall, are actually supported by sitting, right on the table. And as one of the earliest parts of the piece, I positioned the three and built around each of them sort of like a cuff. What I've used a lot, sometimes even letting bits of it show, but usually it disappears in the mounting, has been aquarium air pipe. That's just really thin and very flexible and strong, but you can cut it easily. And if you do the right sort of maneuvering of it, you can actually even stick one into the other by making little slits and working hard at it and so on and so forth. And so I put those around like a collar around each of those big stones and then mounted from that. Anytime I picked up that piece, I had to just literally pick up the rocks first and then move the rest of the piece. Other times when I'm not using rocks, there's things that, either have like a bead hole or something to attach with. I haven't used rocks much because they're so heavy.
Okay, and another question. Can we visit the law school on the CU campus and see your intricate and fascinating pieces?
You can do that. And Nicole Drain, who does the Tuesday evening, and I know each other from the law school where many of you might know she works. And we had about a year and a half or something of overlap before I retired. And one of my pieces is always on rotation in what's called there the faculty assistant, I think is the term still used, suite where Nicole works. And that, if you were there during work hours and that office door were open on the 4th floor, I'm sure Nicole would be happy to usher you in to see whatever piece is up there. And then the 3 that are part of the public land suite are definitely, anytime the building is open, you can go in, they're up on the 4th floor. Oh, and there's a message I see from Nicole. And there are 3 pieces up there that are right in a hallway, very close to the top of the stairs and not far from the elevator on the 4th floor.
Yeah, and Nicole says, hi all, happy to show off Al's pieces here at the law school. Thanks, Nicole, for listening into the program. Another question, Al. Is your knotting similar to sumac, which is a tapestry weaving technique?
I don't know. The person who asked was going to have to tell me. One thing, just as an aside, I'm sort of embarrassingly uneducated about anything but the double half hitch. I might be the world's premier person right now on the double half hitch, but I really don't know other techniques with fiber and even other knots. So I don't know if it is or isn't like sumac.
Okay. There's a comment. ingenious use of something meant for another purpose. I think those were your found recycled objects. And a question. Do you sketch out a design before you start knotting? I think you addressed that, but maybe you can say afterwards.
Well, about 25% of the time, I think roughly, I do. And I have a little file that keeps those drawings. For me, it's sort of interesting to see how close or not the final product comes out to that. And sometimes very similarly, but as I mentioned, there's all sorts of instruction that happens while I'm doing the work. What I do know about, just from experience from my creative process, is that almost without fail, when I'm on the last maybe quarter of whatever piece I'm working on, I find while I'm knotting, starting to see in my mind the picture of the next piece. And so far, one of these days, this will fail me, but so far, every time I've finished a piece, I'm ready to go with the next one in my mind. And usually that's where it's located. And I almost always start the same or next day. I don't know how others of you feel about this, but after I've put so much of my soul and life for 2.5 months or whatever into a piece, when it's over, I'm sort of grieving a little. It's like a tremendous, where's my piece? So having the next piece to literally dive into instantly is usually what I do.
Another comment for you, Al. Such skill, not luck. Maybe a little bit of luck. And I wanted to add, don't apologize for your old photographs. They were beautifully shown on the presentation. And it really, the close-ups especially, being able to see the detail of your work was amazing. No apologies necessary. And,
okay.
And we have another question. And this is one, you're getting this from a textile artist. What does the back look like?
If you'll bear with me. So here is bandwidth, and here's the back.
That's awesome.
I decided almost the first time I made a piece that I wasn't going to do anything to make secret what it looks like, where things were cut and what I, borrowed and brought over, and that, it wouldn't show when it was hanging. And it almost felt like fraud or something to try to cover the reality of, what it was. So I've always left them just completely uncovered.
Thank you so much. And a couple people asked that same question. And so thank you for showing us the back of your work. And then a very clever comment, aha, a knots full basket for Knoxville conversion.
Ow.
Sense of humor. I know you have a good sense of humor from telling us about all of your work. So there's another question. Can you spell the name of the technique developed by the Italian Montessori school? Thanks.
Yes. Yeah. Cavandoli. And it's very much like with all the Latin languages, almost exactly spelled as it sounds. Cavandoli. Cavandoli. And it sometimes is referred to as Cavandoli weaving, and you see it sometimes Cavandoli knotting or Cavandoli macrame, but it's all the same.
Okay, so here's a refrain. Would love to see the backside of any work. Beautiful, thank you. And how and where can one learn some of these techniques?
Well, tomorrow evening is a very first start. And I have done one workshop in March. I did a presentation similar to this, and then a half-day workshop starting, with the knot itself, and then getting through in a half day fewer than I thought of the specific skills. But I mean, one can literally, I've done it to have a slide for tomorrow's presentation. You can just go online and Google double half hitch. And as you could probably Google macrame or a lot of things, but double half hitch will get you right to some very, very clear, almost, foolproof diagrams of how to make that knot. And once you know how to make that knot, I mean, this was true for me, you can almost do anything. I mean, there are all sorts of things like, how do I mount? How do I end? How do I add new weft? But I stumbled upon, or, self-taught all these things. It's not rocket science by any means. And for people like probably all of you listening who have, pretty sophisticated understandings of fiber, I bet once you just, if you don't know already how to do the double half hitch, just do it. And then if you listen to me tomorrow night, if you're really interested in doing this, I mean, tomorrow night's presentation, I spent the time to make my half-day workshop into a PowerPoint. I mean, it's obviously not hands-on for all the participants and so on and so forth, but I am actually sort of go through some ideas and thinking and slides, which will be available after, about different ways to mount, different ways to end, and then show examples of my work, which I'll talk you through tomorrow evening. But, coupled with just access to the internet to look up, if you don't know it, how to do that knot. And then my talk tomorrow night, I bet there's many of you out there who the next day could sit down and start creating something with macrame.
A couple more comments. Great presentation. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Very interesting, beautiful work, and all very new to me. Wonderful presentation. I'll be there tomorrow evening for sure. And a question. Do you ever work with linen?
Yes, actually in the early days, and very heavily used in the piece called Purple Gridlock, which had the three old pieces of a plant hanger. I was able to get, I think it was 2 millimeter, it might have been 1.5 millimeter linen cord in some great colors like that purple and deep red. And I used them for many of my early years. And I've never since been able to find 2 millimeter or even 1.5 millimeter linen. I found it in like thread, tiny stuff. And it's often sold waxed as wax linen. And I have used some of that, but it's a little too skinny for me. Because, as you'd imagine, if you use 2 millimeter instead of 1 millimeter gauge, you have half the number of knots to make to cover the same ground. And that tiny little linen twine, which is all I can find now. If anybody knows a resource for 2 millimeter linen cord, please let me know.
Great. And 2 final messages that I see here. I think Al should offer a workshop for us, exclamation point. And I'll add another exclamation point. And great, thank you, love your work. And one more that just came in, didn't realize I used the double half hitch to tighten up rope when I secured the load in my moving van this past week.
It won't come out.
So awesome. So I am going to remove the spotlight, and if everyone clicks up in the upper right-hand corner back to gallery view, if anyone would like to ask Al a live question, you can unmute and ask your question live.
Yes, I would.
Yes.
Yes. Al, being a kindred spirit of the half hitch, this would have been, I need to bring my camera up here. Sorry about that. This would have been about 1977.
Yep. Very nice.
When I was working in that more of a 10-2 size cord, this is nylon.
Mm-hmm.
But having that warp become weft seems like just a natural progression.
Yeah, it does. I mean, if the children could do it and Valentina Cavandoli's class. All of you can.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You can unmute. And Gina? You're muted, dear.
There we go. In 1971, I moved to Martha's Vineyard for the summer, and my next door neighbor was Ruth Gordon, who many of you may have heard of, famous actress. And I had made this macrame necklace that she bought from me for $40-something, which was really exciting. And my mother got into macrame as well. And I have this one piece of hers, which was a light. We put a light fixture in, and here it is, hanging in our bathroom. But I'm not sure if we worked on it together or she just did it herself or what. But yeah, there it is.
It's a classic piece and nice.
It definitely is. And I so enjoyed this, your presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow night and possibly meeting with you sometime as many of the others would like to, for a little class or something. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Gina.
Okay, any other questions for our speaker? So grateful that you could be here with us. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, there's a question just appeared in the chat. What was the name of that person again who worked with children? Cavandoli, is that?
Cavandoli, Valentina Cavandoli.
And I'll just point everybody that Al has a wonderful website, cannerfiberart.com. Correct? Is that correct, Al?
That is.
Cannerfiberart.com. I put that in the chat. And you can go there to see these pieces again and learn more. And so thank you so much, Al. We so appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great pleasure.
So let's show our appreciation. Thank you so much.